Here we are. We're live. I'm Jimmy. This is Philosophy for Everyday Life, and this is a weekly Philosophy Hour live stream. What I've been doing in these live streams over the last several weeks, actually almost a couple of months now, is looking at Michel de Certeau's book, The Practice of Everyday Life. The reason I've selected this book is that it, in a way, articulates the theme of this channel, which is to ask what it means to practice freedom uh, in an everyday way. And I'm interested specifically in how philosophy can be an aid to the practice of freedom. So I thought I'd spend some time on this book um, to unpack this idea a little bit, to reflect on it, to give it some extra space to think about what this really involves. It's also a somewhat difficult text. French philosophy can and social theory can be difficult to read. The style can be convoluted and suggestive and honestly sometimes impenetrable. Um, so I thought it'd be interesting to spend some time getting into this text and trying to get a feel for it. There are really two ways to approach trying to understand a text like this. One is to try to summarize the main ideas, in a way to translate them into a language that feels more understandable. And I've tried to do that along the way in these videos. And I've also made a couple of videos that discuss Michel de Certeau's thought in a more general level. But I also think that part of understanding the ideas of a given author really requires learning to speak that author's language. And the only way to do that is to actually get into the text itself. And of course, anyone can do that on their own time. But I like the idea of getting into a text as a group. There's only a hypothetical group here right now, but over time, I like the idea of inviting a group to read a text together in a way to practice speaking the language of the text. And I think that actually reading the text out loud is a really interesting and effective way to do this. It's not the only thing one might do, um, but it allows the text to be engaged in a different way. And the analogy that has come to mind for this is um, driving to the top of a mountain, or taking a gondola or some sort of lift up to the top of a mountain. You get all the same views in a way, and you get to the top, you can get out, you can look around, and then you can go back down to where you were. But the experience of walking or hiking up that mountain is just going to be very different. It's more arduous in a way. It's more challenging in a way. But I think it's also potentially more rewarding. And I view reading a text out loud as something like taking that second way, that second option to actually hike up the mountain itself. Before I get into this specific text, I'll just offer an overview of some of the things that have been discussed so far. So this book, The Practice of Everyday Life, it was written by Michel de Certeau, who was a French Jesuit priest and also a social theorist and a scholar. I view this book as an intervention in French social theory, which, if you're not up to speed on that, that's okay. It doesn't mean it's not relevant to you. Um, but I think de Certeau viewed the big voices in French social theory of the 20th century, the ones that I see him as having in his sights are especially Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu, that they offered these really brilliant theories that were illuminating in many ways. And those theories had a lot to do with how power is exercised and reproduced in society. But de Certeau is worried, in fact, more than worried, he's convinced that these theories end up reproducing the power structures that they describe. Foucault talks about the panopticon, this ability to view or exercise surveillance over everyone in society. And de Certeau does a really brilliant internal critique of Foucault. He criticizes Foucault on his own terms and says, um, the theory itself is panoptic. It is totalizing or exercises surveillance in the same way. And de Certeau makes a similar argument with the theory of Pierre Bourdieu. And what de Certeau wants to offer us as an alternative is not a different theory, because he thinks that would be totalizing in its own way. That would just reproduce the problem he's trying to solve. What he wants instead is for us to think tactically, to recognize that our lives and actions, our ways of speaking, are always performed using a text or a theory or a set of options that's made available by some power structure. We can't get away from it. But can we trace the structure of that power? Can we work in it or within it in ways that subvert it? That's the basic question of the book. And he wants to open up this question in two ways. One, he deconstructs, he kind of destabilizes other theories. But the other way is that he wants to show us examples of what this looks like. And the first obvious example is his work of theoretical deconstruction. But the other way that he does this is by looking at specific practices. I think the most relatable and I think the most famous example of what he's trying to do for us is this chapter, Walking in the City, where Certeau moves from very theoretical academic discussions of other French social theorists to something that most of us have experienced, which is moving around in a large urban environment. And he wants to ask, well, how is this act of walking about in a city similar to this theoretical deconstructive work I was doing in the previous chapters? And how are both of those things similar to an overarching analogy that he uses throughout the book, which is the relationship between language and speech? Language being a sort of abstraction, a fixed set of possibilities for words and grammatical structures, syntax that's available to users, and speech being the way that users actually use it, which might even be kind of subversive and might undo the structure in a certain way. He thinks that walking about in a city is something like the subversive use of speech by individuals who use language in ways that are available to them. Hopefully this will become clearer as I go. But that perhaps will suffice by way of introduction. And now I'm going to get into this text a little bit, and we will practice speaking the language of Michel de Certeau, or hiking toward this peak of some of the ideas that he's trying to propose. So this is part 3 of the book, Spatial Practices, and chapter 7, Walking in the City. And true to form, de Certeau starts out with something like a narrative description or a little meditation on the experience of being in a large city. Seeing Manhattan from the 110th floor of the World Trade Center. Beneath the haze stirred up by the winds, the urban island, a sea in the middle of the sea, lifts up the skyscrapers over Wall Street, sinks down at Greenwich, then rises again to the crests of Midtown. Realizing my microphone is over here. Quietly passes over Central Park, and finally undulates off into the distance beyond Harlem. A wave of verticals. Its agitation is momentarily arrested by vision. The gigantic mass is immobilized before the eyes. It is transformed into a texturology in which extremes coincide. Extremes of ambition and degradation, brutal oppositions of race and styles, contrasts between yesterday's buildings, already transformed into trash cans, and today's urban eruptions that block out its space. Unlike Rome, New York has never learned the art of growing old by playing on all its pasts. Its present invents itself from hour to hour in the act of throwing away its previous accomplishments and challenging the future. a city composed of paroxysmal places in monumental reliefs. The spectator can read in it a universe that is constantly exploding. In it are inscribed the architectural figures of the coincidatio oppositorum, coincidence of opposites, formerly drawn in miniatures and mystical textures. On this stage of concrete, steel, and glass, cut out between two oceans, the Atlantic and the American, by a frigid body of water, the tallest letters in the world compose a giant rhetoric of excess in both expenditure and production. So this is his kind of poetic meditation on the experience of being in New York City. So now he's going to expand a little bit on what he actually wants to do with this. This section is called Voyeurs or Walkers. To what erotics of knowledge does the ecstasy of reading such a cosmos belong? So reading this cosmos, he's imagining the city of New York as a text that can be read. And there's something ecstatic about it, something that brings you out of yourself. And there's an erotics of knowledge, meaning much the same idea, this thing that brings us out of ourself towards some object. Having taken a voluptuous pleasure in it, I wonder, what is the source of this pleasure of, quote, seeing the whole, of looking down on, totalizing the most immoderate of human texts? So being from this high vantage point, he's able to see the whole city, have this totalizing view, this panoptic view, to use the language of Foucault. Why is this so enjoyable, he's asking. To be lifted to the summit of the World Trade Center is to be lifted out of the city's grasp. Okay, that's interesting. The city is something that grasps us or controls us in a way. One's body is no longer clasped by the streets that turn and return it according to an anonymous law, nor is it possessed, whether as player or played, by the rumble of so many differences and by the nervousness of New York traffic. When one goes up there, he leaves behind the mass that carries off and mixes up in itself any identity of authors or spectators. An Icarus flying above these waters, he can ignore the devices of Daedalus in mobile and endless labyrinths far below. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur. Okay, so you're this voyeur viewing the city from above. It puts him at a distance. It transforms the bewitching world by which one was possessed into a text that lies before one's own eyes. It allows one to read it, to be a solar eye looking down like a god. The exaltation of a scopic and Gnostic drive. The fiction of knowledge is related to this lust to be a viewpoint and nothing more. Okay, the fiction of knowledge, that's a powerful idea. Knowledge as something that's fictitious. You can see that he did kind of a bait and switch. He started out by describing this kind of magical view of the city from above. But now he's suggesting to us that what's enjoyable about that view is precisely what's problematic about it. This totalizing view, this fiction of knowledge, this looking down on everything as if one is a god. Must one finally fall back into the dark space where crowds move back and forth? Crowds that, though invisible from on high, are themselves unable to see down below. And a carrion fall. On the 110th floor, a poster, sphinx-like, addresses an enigmatic message to the pedestrian, who is for an instant transformed into a visionary. It's hard to be down when you're up. The desire to see the city preceded the means of satisfying it. So we now have this ability actually to go to these incredible heights in these incredibly tall buildings. Obviously, that wasn't always the case. Medieval or Renaissance painters represented the city as seen in a perspective that no eye had yet enjoyed. This fiction already made the medieval spectator into a celestial eye. It created gods. Have things changed since technical procedures have organized an all-seeing power? The totalizing eye imagined by the painters of earlier times lives on in our achievements. The same scopic drive, this drive to see everything, haunts users of architectural productions by materializing today the utopia that yesterday was only painted. The 1,370-foot high tower that serves as a prow for Manhattan continues to construct the fiction that creates readers, makes the complexity of the city readable, and mobilizes its opaque mobility in a transparent text. This is really important. He's saying this ability to look down on the city and view it like a text immobilizes it. It turns something that's opaque into something that's transparent. Is the immense texturology spread out before one's eyes anything more than a representation, an optical artifact? It is the analog of the facsimile produced through a projection that is a way of keeping aloof by the space planner urbanist, city planner, or cartographer. So just like a map is a facsimile, or a sort of partial representation of the city or the territory that it tries to represent, so this view of the city from above, from a tall building, also is a kind of facsimile. It's a partial representation of what's actually there. The panorama city is a theoretical, that is, visual simulacrum. In short, a picture whose condition of possibility is an oblivion and a misunderstanding of practices. So to have this big view from above requires actually misunderstanding the practices that are happening on the ground. And theoretical, the reason he says that it is visual is just because that's sort of the etymology of the word from Greek words having to do with to see. The voyeur god created by this fiction, who like Schreber's god knows only cadavers, must disentangle himself from the murky, intertwining daily behaviors and make himself alien to them. So in order to have this panoptic view of the city, one has to separate out oneself from daily behaviors. The ordinary practitioners of the city live, quote, down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. So in a way, they're invisible. They walk, an elementary form of the experience of the city. They are walkers, Wandersmänner, whose bodies follow the thicks and thins of an urban text they write without being able to read it. These practitioners make use of spaces that cannot be seen. Their knowledge of them is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. The paths that correspond in this intertwining, unrecognized poems, in which each body is an element signed by many others, elude legibility. This is such a core idea for de Certeau, that there are certain things, certain practices of everyday life, singular events, which are illegible. They can't be read or captured. It is as though the practices organizing a bustling city were characterized by their blindness. The networks of these moving, intersecting writings compose a manifold story that has neither author nor spectator, shaped out of fragments of trajectories and alterations of spaces. In relation to representations, it remains daily and indefinitely other. It can't be represented. Escaping the imaginary totalizations produced by the eye, the everyday has a certain strangeness that does not surface, or whose surface is only its upper limit, outlining itself against the visible. Within this ensemble, I shall try to locate the practices that are foreign to the geometrical or geographical space of visual, panoptic, or theoretical constructions. What is foreign to the theories and other constructions we use to sort of capture the reality of a city? What doesn't fit? What is missed or occluded? These practices of space refer to a specific form of operations, ways of operating. If you remember all the way back to chapter 1 or the introduction, if you've watched previous live streams, operations is a key word. What modes? It's a mode of action, a way of acting or being or doing. So these practices of space refer to a specific form of operations, to another spatiality, an anthropological, poetic, and mythic experience of space. and to an opaque and blind mobility characteristic of the bustling city. A migrational or metaphorical city thus slips into the clear text of the planned and readable city. So we have the planned and readable city that you can see from above, that you can represent in a map or a city plan. And then there's this other city that's sort of pulsing beneath the constructions that we layer onto it, which is invisible and illegible. So section 1, from the concept of the city to urban practices. The World Trade Center is only the most monumental figure of Western urban development. The utopia of optical knowledge has long had the ambition of surmounting and articulating the contradictions arising from urban agglomeration. It is a question of managing a growth of human agglomeration or accumulation. The city is a huge monastery, said Erasmus. Perspective vision and prospective vision constitute the twofold projection of an opaque past and an uncertain future onto a surface that can be dealt with. This is what theories and urban planning are trying to achieve, a surface that can be dealt with. They inaugurate, in the 16th century, the transformation of the urban fact into the concept of a city. Long before the concept itself gives rise to a particular figure of history, it assumes that this fact can be dealt with as a unity determined by an urbanistic ratio. There's like a rationale to it, something that can be grasped conceptually. Linking the city to the concept never makes them identical, but it plays on their progressive symbiosis. To plan a city is both to think the very plurality of the real and to make that way of thinking, the plural, effective. So the real is plural, it's complex, it's multiple. So how do we think it? Well, we use a concept. But then we take the concept, we turn it around, and we try to realize the concept. We try to make, not only do we try to capture or describe reality by means of our concept, but we then try to bring reality into conformity with the concept. It is to know how to articulate it and be able to do it. An operational concept. The city, founded by utopian and urbanistic discourse, is defined by the possibility of a threefold operation. 1, the production of its own space, un espace propre, which, if you remember, having one's own space is a critical part of what de Certeau means by a strategy, which is the opposite of a tactic. Rational organization must thus repress all the physical, mental, and political pollutions that would compromise it. So you have to exclude anything that doesn't belong, however you define the city. 2, the substitution of a know-when or of a synchronistic system for the indeterminable and stubborn resistances offered by traditions. So the concept has to be timeless. It has to be something that doesn't refer to a specific moment in history or time. Univocal scientific strategies, made possible by the flattening out of all the data in a plane projection, must replace the tactics of users who take advantage of, quote, opportunities, and who through these trap events, these lapses in visibility, reproduce the opacities of history everywhere. Finally, the creation of a universal and anonymous subject, which is the city itself. It gradually becomes possible to attribute to it, as to its political model, Hobbes's state, all the functions and predicates that were previously scattered and assigned to many different real subjects, groups, associations, or individuals. The city, like a proper name, thus provides a way of conceiving and constructing space on the basis of a finite number of stable, isolatable, and interconnected properties. So we take this thing that is complex and multifaceted, and we turn it into a single, universal, anonymous subject, which we name the city. Administration is combined with a process of elimination, in this place organized by speculative and classificatory operations. On the one hand, there is a differentiation and redistribution of the parts and functions of the city as a result of inversions, displacements, accumulations, etc. On the other, there is a rejection of everything that is not capable of being dealt with in this way, and so constitutes the waste products of a functionalist administration: abnormality, deviance, illness, death, etc. So we differentiate and redistribute the parts and functions of the city, basically administration through bureaucracy. We also reject everything not capable of being dealt with in this way. Anything that doesn't fit into the concept and the structure, the bureaucratic structure, is rejected. To be sure, progress allows an increasing number of these waste products to be reintroduced into administrative circuits. It transforms even deficiencies in health, security, etc., into ways of making the networks of order denser. But in reality, it repeatedly produces effects contrary to those at which it aims. The profit system generates a loss, which in the multiple forms of wretchedness and poverty outside the system and of waste inside it, constantly turns production into expenditure. So the system produces effects contrary to those at which it aims. I think we need to see how he justifies that claim. Moreover, the rationalization of the city leads to its mythification in strategic discourses, which are calculations based on the hypothesis or the necessity of its destruction in order to arrive at a final destination. Finally, the functionalist organization, by privileging progress, that is time, causes the condition of its own possibility, space itself, to be forgotten. Space thus becomes the blind spot in a scientific and political technology. This is the way in which the concept city functions, a place of transformations and appropriations, the object of various kinds of interference, but also a subject that is constantly enriched by new attributes. It is simultaneously the machinery and the hero of modernity. The machinery and the hero of modernity. So he's saying the city, if we think of modernity, I'm assuming he's using this in a kind of Weberian sense as a process of rationalization through bureaucracy. The city, the concept city, the city as a concept that we attempt to impose on something that is complex and multifaceted. It's the machinery and the hero of modernity. So it's how this process of making bureaucratic takes place, and it's the hero of that process. Today, whatever the avatars of this concept may have been, we have to acknowledge that if in discourse the city serves as a totalizing and almost mythical landmark for socioeconomic and political strategies, urban life increasingly permits the reemergence of the element that the urbanistic project excluded. So the concept of the city tries to exclude anything that doesn't fit. But that thing that was excluded, marginalized, keeps re-emerging. The language of power is in itself urbanizing, but the city is left prey to contradictory movements that counterbalance and combine themselves outside the reach of panoptic power. He's talking about Foucault's description of surveillance. The city becomes the dominant theme in political legends, but it is no longer a field of programmed and regulated operations. Beneath the discourses that ideologize the city, the ruses and combinations of powers that have no readable identity proliferate. Without points where one can take hold of them, without rational transparency, they are impossible to administer. So the city is an example of this phenomenon that de Certeau is tracing in the book, which is given a structure which is inescapable, a structure of power, a structure of language, a structure of social capital. What possibilities for subversion are there? if you can't subvert the structure by going outside of it, what can you do from within it? This is the whole premise of the book. And he's saying, just like these other structures he's looked at, language, strategy, conceived broadly, social theory, the city is also a structure. It's a structure that aims to totalize, to capture everything, and to bring everything into conformity with it. But he's saying there remain these ruses and combinations of powers that are impossible to administer, even by something as totalizing as the modern city. So the return of practices. The concept city is decaying. Does that mean that the illness afflicting both the rationality that founded it and its professionals afflicts the urban populations as well? Perhaps cities are deteriorating along with the procedures that organized them. But we must be careful here. The ministers of knowledge have always assumed that the whole universe was threatened by the very changes that affected their ideologies and their positions. They transmute the misfortune of their theories into theories of misfortune. When they transform their bewilderment into catastrophes, when they seek to enclose the people in the panic of their discourses, are they once more necessarily right? He's being a little opaque here, but I think it will get clearer as we go. Rather than remaining within the field of a discourse that upholds its privilege by inverting its content, speaking of catastrophe and no longer of progress, one can try another path. I think this is a typo here. One can analyze the microbe-like singular and plural practices which an urbanistic system was supposed to administer or suppress, but which have outlived its decay. So this is what he's proposing to do in this chapter. What are these microbe-like singular and plural practices that the city, the concept city, as he calls it, was supposed to bring into conformity with the concept, but which it couldn't control? One can follow the swarming activity of these procedures that, far from being regulated or eliminated by panoptic administration, have reinforced themselves into a proliferating illegitimacy, developed and insinuated themselves into the networks of surveillance, and combined in accord with unreadable but stable tactics, to the point of constituting everyday regulations and surreptitious creativities that are merely concealed by the frantic mechanisms and discourses of the observational organization. Let's do this. The attempt to control actually conceals what's happening under the surface, he's saying. This pathway could be inscribed as a consequence, but also as the reciprocal of Foucault's analysis of the structures of power. Okay, so he's saying this could be viewed as an implication of Foucault's analysis, but also as a reciprocal. In other words, somehow the opposite of what Foucault analyzed. He moved it in the direction of mechanisms and technical procedures, minor instrumentalities, capable merely by their organization of details of transforming a human multiplicity into a disciplinary society, and of managing, differentiating, classifying, and hierarchizing all deviances concerning apprenticeship, health, justice, the army, or work. This is what Foucault analyzed. How do we transform a human multiplicity into a disciplinary society? These often minuscule ruses of discipline, these minor but flawless mechanisms, draw their efficacy from a relationship between procedures and the space that they redistribute in order to make an operator out of it. But what spatial practices correspond in the area where discipline is manipulated to these apparatuses that produce a disciplinary space? So Foucault's talking about these apparatuses that produce a space that is disciplined, where behavior is shaped. What spatial practices correspond to this? Take a drink. In the present conjuncture, which is marked by a contradiction between the collective mode of administration and an individual mode of reappropriation, the question is no less important. If one admits that spatial practices, in fact, secretly structure the determining conditions of social life. He's trying to make visible what are the spatial practices that Foucault misses that are actually structuring the conditions of social life. I would like to follow out a few of these multiform, resistance, tricky, and stubborn procedures that elude discipline without being outside the field in which it is exercised, and which should lead us to a theory of everyday practices of lived space, of the disquieting familiarity of the city. This is an excellent description of a tactic as de Certeau understands it. Stubborn procedures that elude discipline without being outside the field in which they are exercised, or it is exercised, discipline. Foucault describes this field in which discipline is exercised. And de Certeau is admitting with Foucault that the field is inescapable. There is a structure and a grid of discipline, and there's no vantage point outside it. But what de Certeau wants to add is there are spatial practices, stubborn procedures that elude the discipline without going outside the field where the discipline is exercised. It's a little bit paradoxical. But he wants to theorize this. He wants to say, what are these things? He wants to look at them. These everyday practices of lived space, of the disquieting familiarity of the city. Section 2, the chorus of idle footsteps. The goddess can be recognized by her step. Their story begins on ground level with footsteps. They are myriad, but do not compose a series. They cannot be counted, because each unit has a qualitative character, a style of tactile apprehension, and kinesthetic appropriation. Their swarming mass is an innumerable collection of singularities. And if you remember from the preface to the English translation of this book, de Certeau says that he wants a science of singularity. He's interested in the particular, in the singular, not in the grand theoretical constructs that capture everything. Their intertwined paths give their shape to spaces. They weave places together. In that respect, pedestrian movements form one of these real systems whose existence, in fact, makes up the city. They are not localized. It is rather that they that spatialize. They are no more inserted within a container than those Chinese characters speakers sketch out on their hands with their fingertips. It is true that the operations of walking can be traced on city maps in such a way as to transcribe their paths. Here, well-trodden, there, very faint. So we can take the kind of statistical average of where people walk and their trajectories going this way and not that. But these thick or thin curbs only refer, like words, to the absence of what has passed by. Surveys of routes miss what was, the act itself of passing by. So we can count how many times people passed by this way or that way, which direction they were going. But in doing this, we're never capturing the actual act, the singularity of the act of passing by. The operation of walking, wandering, or window shopping, that is, the activity of passers-by, is transformed into points that draw a totalizing and reversible line on the map. They allow us to grasp only a relic set in the know-when of a surface of projection. Itself visible, it has the effect of making invisible the operation that made it possible. So in viewing these conceptual constructs, these maps that might exhibit the ways that people walk, the places they have walked, we're actually, by attending to that, we are necessarily not attending to the acts that led to that representation in a map. By looking at the concept, the abstraction, we're necessarily not looking at the particular. C.S. Lewis has an interesting discussion of pleasure, or in general, I think of experience, where he says, the more that we are describing our own experience, the less we are in the process of actually experiencing it. But the more we go into that process of experience, the less capacity we have for stepping back and describing. It's kind of a paradox. I think de Certeau is referring to something similar here. These fixations, these concepts or representations, constitute procedures for forgetting. The trace left behind is substituted for the practice. There's a substitution or a replacement. It exhibits the voracious property that the geographical system has of being able to transform action into legibility, but in doing so, it causes a way of being in the world to be forgotten. And that, I hear a little hint of Heidegger in the background there. Pedestrian speech acts. A comparison with the speech act will allow us to go further and not limit ourselves to the critique of graphic representations alone, looking from the shores of legibility toward an inaccessible beyond. So he's been talking about visual, graphic, pictorial representation so far. Now he's going to bring us back to the speech act, which I've said this, I think, in most of my videos on de Certeau. The act of speaking is the fundamental analogy or image or metaphor that de Certeau uses for his analysis of singularity in the book. Or to put it differently, if I can, the act of speaking, enunciating, is the overriding metaphor of this book. And he uses it in a series of analogies of different phenomena to give us a framework for thinking about each of them, for thinking about what's singular or what possibilities of singularity are there in each of these different realms or domains that seem quite different. Most of us wouldn't ordinarily or automatically connect walking around in a city in relation to the structure of the city with kind of dealing with social theories, abstract academic social theories, with all the other examples of singularity or tactics that de Certeau looks at in this book. But he wants to use this concept of speech, the speech act, to tie together all these very different phenomena that he looks at. So the act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is to language, or to the statements uttered. This is the broad conceptual framework of this chapter, this basic analogy. So we have walking is to urban system as speech act is to language. So urban system and language are these totalizing constructs. Walking and speech act are the way that users act on the terms of those totalizing constructs, but also have the possibility of subverting those constructs in the process. At the most elementary level, it has a triple enunciative function. It is a process of appropriation of the topographical system on the part of the pedestrian, just as the speaker appropriates and takes on the language. So here's why or how these things are analogous. Walking, speaking. It is a spatial acting out of the place, just as the speech act is an acoustic acting out of language. And it implies relations among differentiated positions, that is, among pragmatic contracts in the form of movements, just as verbal enunciation is an allocution, posits another opposite the speaker, and puts contracts between interlocutors into action. So he's fleshing out the analogy. It thus seems possible to give a preliminary definition of walking as a space of enunciation. We could, moreover, extend this problematic to the relations between the act of writing and the written text, and even transpose it to the relationships between the hand, the touch, and the tail of the paintbrush, and the finished painting, forms, colors, etc. At first isolated in the area of verbal communication, the speech act turns out to find only one of its applications there, and its linguistic modality is merely the first determination of a much more general distinction between the forms used in a system and the ways of using this system, that is, the rules. That is between two different worlds, since the same things are considered from two opposite formal viewpoints. This is a nice articulation of the general idea. So he's interested in this distinction between the forms used in a system and the ways of using this system, that is, the rules. In other words, what you're supposed to do and what people actually do, in a way. Considered from this angle, the Pedestrian Speech Act has three characteristics which distinguish it at the outset from the spatial system: the present, the discrete, the phatic. Okay, so he's going to unpack this Pedestrian Speech Act. In other words, how walking is similar to speaking, using three ideas. First, if it is true that a spatial order organizes an ensemble of possibilities, e.g. by a place in which one can move, and interdictions, e.g. by a wall that prevents one from going further, then the walker actualizes some of these possibilities, and that way he makes them exist, as well as emerge. But he also moves them about, and he invents others, since the crossing, drifting away, or improvisation of walking privilege, transform, or abandon spatial elements. Moves them about and invents others. Thus, Charlie Chaplin multiplies the possibilities of his cane. He does other things with the same thing, and he goes beyond the limits that the determinants of the object set on its utilization. In the same way, the walker transforms each spatial signifier into something else. And if on the one hand he actualizes only a few of the possibilities fixed by the constructed order, he goes only here and not there. On the other, he increases the number of possibilities, for example, by creating shortcuts and detours, and prohibitions. For example, he forbids himself to take paths generally considered accessible or even obligatory. He thus makes a selection. The user of a city picks out certain fragments of the statement in order to actualize them in secret. This also reminds me of things like parkour or urban climbing, where people make a very unexpected use of urban objects, totally sort of unintended use. He thus creates a discreteness, whether by making choices among the signifiers of the spatial language, or by displacing them through the use he makes of them. He condemns certain places to inertia or disappearance, and composes with others spatial turns of phrase that are rare, spatial turns of phrase. Accidental or illegitimate, but that already leads into a rhetoric of walking. I was watching a video on the impact of AI on human language, and how AI produces the most probable next word or next pixel given a certain set of inputs. I feel like that's just a really pertinent example of what de Certeau is talking about. Because what he's saying is, well, if you're a user of language, you have the option to choose a very improbable next word. If you're walking about a city, AI, Google Maps, could tell you what's the most probable next place you'll go. But as, what does he call it? The Pedestrian Speech Act, as a pedestrian speaker, we have the option to go somewhere that's totally unlikely and totally improbable. But if we're dependent on algorithms that rely on probability distributions, we miss these singular acts of use or disuse. In the framework of enunciation, the walker constitutes, in relation to his position, both a near and a far, a here and a there. To the fact that the adverbs here and there are the indicators of the locutionary seat in verbal communication, a coincidence that reinforces the parallelism between linguistic and pedestrian enunciation. This is the analogy he's working on. We must add that this location, here, there, necessarily implied by walking and indicative of a present appropriation of space by an I, also has the function of introducing an other in relation to this I, and of thus establishing a conjunctive and disjunctive articulation of places. Go back to these three elements he said. Okay, we've got the present, the discrete, the phatic. Okay, here's discreteness. So I think what he means by the present is just this act of making a selection out of, you have to make a selection right now out of a whole series of possibilities. Discreteness, you're choosing one thing and not another. We've also got this phatic aspect, by which I mean, he says, the function isolated by Malinowski and Jacobson of terms that initiate, maintain, or interrupt contact. Walking, such as hello, well, etc. Walking, which alternately follows a path and has followers, creates a mobile organicity in the environment, a sequence of phatic topoi, places, subject matters. And if it is true that the phatic function, which is an effort to ensure communication, is already characteristic of the language of talking birds, just as it constitutes the, quote, first verbal function acquired by children, it is not surprising that it also gambols, goes on all fours, dances, and walks about, with a light or heavy step, like a series of hellos in an echoing labyrinth, anterior or parallel to informative speech. So I think the point he's making here is simply that the way that walking is analogous to a speech act isn't maybe primarily in attempting to communicate meaning or to convey information or something like that, but just in this act of making contact, these like way that animals or young children use speech to connect without any obvious meaning behind the words. The modalities of pedestrian enunciation, which a plain representation on a map brings out, could be analyzed. They include the kinds of relationship this enunciation entertains with particular paths or statements, by according them a truth value, alethic modalities of the necessary, the impossible, the possible, or the contingent, an epistemological value, epistemic modalities of the certain, the excluded, the plausible, or the questionable, or finally, an ethical or legal value, deontic modalities of the obligatory, the forbidden, the permitted, or the optional. Walking affirms, suspects, tries out, transgresses, respects, etc., the trajectories it speaks. All the modalities sing a part in this chorus, changing from step to step, stepping in through proportions, sequences, and intensities, which vary according to the time, the path taken, and the walker. These enunciatory operations are of an unlimited diversity. They therefore cannot be reduced to their graphic trail. This is all somewhat abstract, but the point is stated at the end here, that there's this unlimited diversity of options for, quote, enunciation by means of walking in a city, and that any attempt to represent them graphically, statistically, is going to miss what's going on. I'm just going to see how much I have left in this chapter. This is called Walking Rhetorics, section 3. it would take quite a long time to read through all of this. So I'll probably just finish up this last section, last subsection. We'll do actually, maybe I'll skip this section because it gets into some more theoretical stuff. Okay, this is all somewhat theoretical. I think I'll just keep going where I'm at. Okay, walking rhetorics. The walking of passers-by offers a series of tours, and detours that can be compared to turns of phrase or stylistic figures. So he's continuing to flesh out this analogy between walking and speech. There is a rhetoric of walking. The art of turning phrases finds an equivalent in the art of composing a path. Tourner un parcours. Like ordinary language, this art implies and combines styles and uses. Style specifies a linguistic structure that manifests on the symbolic level, an individual's fundamental way of being in the world. It connotes a singular. Use defines the social phenomenon through which a system of communication manifests itself in actual fact. It refers to a norm. Style and use both have to do with a way of operating, of speaking, walking, etc. But style involves a peculiar processing of the symbolic, while use refers to the elements of a code. So style versus use. They intersect to form a style of use, a way of being and a way of operating. In introducing the notion of a residing rhetoric, habitant, the fertile pathway opened up by A. Madame and systematized by S. Ostrowetsky and J.F. Augiard, we assume that the tropes cataloged by rhetoric furnish models and hypotheses for the analysis of ways of appropriating places. So he's going to unpack the analogy between speech and walking a little further. Sometimes it feels like de Certeau is showing off his virtuosity a little bit because he's saying, okay, well, that was interesting to compare speech and walking. Let's try to flesh out the analogy a little bit more, and I'm going to use this rhetorical theory to do that. So he's showing off his knowledge, perhaps, of some of this theory, but also there's potentially some very interesting expansion of the concept here. Two postulates seem to me to underlie the validity of this application. One, it is assumed that practices of space also correspond to manipulations of the basic elements of a constructed order. So using space and using rhetoric or style are both ways of making use of a pre-existing order. Two, it is assumed that they are, that is, practices of space are, like the tropes in rhetoric, deviations relative to a sort of literal meaning defined by the urbanistic system. So to use a figure of speech is, in a way, a verbal deviation. It's taking language and folding it back on itself in a surprising way, and using it against its, quote, literal meaning, if that is actually a real thing in the end. And he's saying we can use this idea of a figure of speech as a further analogy to think about the way that practices of space work with the quote literal meaning of an urban system. There would thus be a homology, or an analogy, a sameness, between verbal figures and the figures of walking. A stylized selection among the latter is already found in the figures of dancing. Insofar as both consist in treatments or operations bearing on isolatable units and in ambiguous dispositions that divert and displace meaning in the direction of equivocalness. Equivocal is when, a word is used in two distinct ways with two distinct meanings. In the way a tremulous image confuses and multiplies the photographed object. Interesting. In these two modes, the analogy can be accepted. I would add that the geometrical space of urbanists and architects seems to have the status of the proper meaning, constructed by grammarians and linguists, in order to have a normal and normative level to which they can compare the drifting of figurative language. In reality, this faceless proper meaning, so propre sens figure, interesting, cannot be found in current use, whether verbal or pedestrian. It is merely the fiction, produced by a use that is also particular, the metalinguistic use of science that distinguishes itself by that very distinction. So he's saying the correct meaning of a word, or the correct use of a physical space, is itself a fiction made up by people who want to establish that correct meaning or use. There is no actual correct meaning. Still, we can play with these established correct meanings, even if they're constructed, and think about both figures of speech and language, where language is used in quote, incorrect ways, and incorrect uses of space. I'm imagining, say, a real estate development or an architectural drawing of a building, thinking of something like a student center at a university where the students go to this place to do that, or the residents go to this building for this purpose, and then thinking about all the unintended, counterintuitive, creative figures of speech or figures of space, if we want to call them that, which run against the intended meaning, the fictions that were created for how these things are to be used. The long poem of walking manipulates spatial organizations, no matter how panoptic they may be. It is neither foreign to them, it can take place only within them, nor in conformity with them. It does not receive its identity from them. It creates shadows and ambiguities within them. It inserts its multitudinous references and citations into them, social models, cultural mores, personal factors. Within them, it is itself the effect of successive encounters and occasions that constantly alter it and make it the other's blazon. In other words, it is like a peddler carrying something surprising, transverse, or attractive, compared with the usual choice. These diverse aspects provide the basis of a rhetoric. They can even be said to define it. By analyzing this modern art of everyday expression as it appears in accounts of spatial practices, J.F. Ogiard discerns in it two especially fundamental stylistic features. All right, so he's going to get more specific: synecdoche and asyndeton. The predominance of these two figures seems to me to indicate, in relation to two complementary poles, a formal structure of these practices. Synecdoche consists in using a word in a sense which is part of another meaning of the same word. Using a word in essence, it names a part instead of the whole which includes it. Thus, sail is taken for ship in the expression a fleet of 50 sails. It's clear enough. I think the definition of synecdoche there is a little confusing, but you could see what it means from this example. In the same way, a brick shelter or a hill is taken for the park in the narration of a trajectory. Asyndeton is the suppression of linking words, such as conjunctions and adverbs, either within a sentence or between sentences. In the same way, in walking, it selects and fragments the space traversed. It skips over links and whole parts that it omits. Okay, so here's our analogy when he says in the same way. So the analogy for synecdoche in walking is when we say a brick shelter or a hill is taken for the park in the narration of a trajectory. So the brick shelter stands in for the park as a whole. Or when we skip over and links or omit parts in walking. From this point of view, every walk constantly leaps or skips like a child hopping on one foot. It practices the ellipsis of conjunctive loci, skipping over things. In reality, these two pedestrian figures are related. Synecdoche expands a spatial element in order to make it play the role of a totality, and take its place. The bicycle or the piece of furniture in a store window stands for a whole street or neighborhood. A syndeton, by elision, by cutting out, creates a less, opens gaps in the spatial continuum, and retains only selected parts of it that amount almost to relics. Synecdoche replaces totalities by fragments, a less in the place of more. A syndeton disconnects them by eliminating the conjunctive or the consecutive, nothing in place of something. Synecdoche makes more dense. It amplifies the detail and miniaturizes the whole. A syndeton cuts it out. It undoes continuity and undercuts its plausibility. A space treated in this way and shaped by practices is transformed into enlarged singularities and separate islands. Again, he's interested in analyzing singularities, so you can see why this is of interest to him. Through these swellings, shrinkings, and fragmentations, that is, through these rhetorical operations, a spatial phrasing of an analogical, composed of juxtaposed citations, and elliptical, made of gaps, lapses, and allusions, type is created. For the technological system of a coherent and totalizing space that is linked and simultaneous, the figures of pedestrian rhetoric substitute trajectories that have a mythical structure, at least if one understands by myth a discourse relative to the place/nowhere or origin of concrete existence, a story jerry-built out of elements taken from common sayings, an elusive and fragmentary story whose gaps mesh with the social practices it symbolizes. Okay. I'd like to hear him provide more examples of what this looks like actually in practice. This feels, for all his talk of the concrete, the singularity, this feels very theoretical and abstract. But the idea is that if a representation of a city is totalizing, there are no gaps. We have this idea of figures of speech, which on the one hand take something singular and blow it up through, this is synecdoche, when we say like that one little detail represents the whole. You can almost imagine one of these maps intended for tourists where individual items that are supposed to be of significance are displayed larger than other items. On the other hand, we have gaps, things that are left out. This is asyndeton, things that should be there but are not there. He's trying to illustrate how using the analogy of figures of speech undoes the totality of representation of an urban space. Figures are the acts of this stylistic metamorphosis of space. Or rather, as Rilke puts it, they are moving trees of gestures. They move even the rigid and contrived territories of the medico-pedagogical institute, in which retarded children recognizing some outdated language here, find a place to play and dance their spatial stories. These trees of gestures are in movement everywhere. Their forests walk through the streets. They transform the scene, but they cannot be fixed in a certain place by images. If, in spite of that, an illustration were required, we could mention the fleeting images, yellowish, green, and metallic blue, calligraphies that howl without raising their voices and emblazon themselves on the subterranean passages of the city. Embroideries composed of letters and numbers, perfect gestures of violence painted with a pistol. Shivas made of written characters, dancing graphics whose fleeting apparitions are accompanied by the rumble of subway trains, New York graffiti. So New York graffiti is an example of this stylistic metamorphosis of space that he's trying to describe. If it is true that forests of gestures are manifest in the streets, their movement cannot be captured in a picture, nor can the meaning of their movements be circumscribed in a text. Their rhetorical transplantation carries away and displaces the analytical, coherent, proper meanings of urbanism. It constitutes a wandering of the semantic, produced by masses that make some parts of the city disappear and exaggerate others, distorting it, fragmenting it, and diverting it from its immobile order. I'm going to stop there. I hope this gives you a taste of this chapter and gives you a framework for thinking about what de Certeau is doing in the chapter, so that if you want to read the rest, hopefully you at least have somewhere to put what he does. I think this will also be my last live stream on Michel de Certeau. This book is very rich. I could easily do another 5 live streams on it. But I hope, again, that this is enough for someone who's struggling to get into the text, but wants to get into the text, that you could sort of learn the language or start to learn the language from these readings and discussions. And to attempt to totalize the text itself by covering every aspect of it. Maybe that would run against the spirit of Michel de Certeau anyway. So yeah, if you've watched to this point, I'm really glad you're here. Glad that hope you found something beneficial here. If you'd like to connect further, I am on Substack, and my plan is to keep doing live streams, and to keep exploring what it means to do philosophy as a practice, as one of these everyday practices of singularity that cannot be captured and contained by the systems of power that structure our lives today. So if that's something that is of interest to you, I hope you'll join for the journey. So